About 5 years ago, I decided to take my girlfriend Abby to the zoo. I've never had strong feelings about the zoo, didn't dislike it, didn't love it. There was always something a bit off-putting about seeing animals in cages, but not enough to stop me from going. On my own, I wouldn't choose it as a destination, but for Abby, I was willing to go. That week, both Abby and I had a rare Thursday off from work. We thought it would be a great idea to visit the zoo on a weekday to avoid the usual weekend crowds. When we arrived at the parking lot, it looked like our plan was working. The place was only half as busy as usual, even though it was just after opening at 9:00 a.m. We got out of the car, applied some sunscreen, and made sure our snacks were packed in our backpacks. Abby squealed with excitement when she saw the zoo entrance sign, which brought a smile to my face. My primary goal was to see her happy, not necessarily to see the animals. As we approached the gate, Abby held my hand and nearly skipped with excitement. We talked about which animals to see first as we stood in line for tickets. My attention was split between Abby's questions and fumbling with my wallet to find my credit card. When it was our turn at the ticket booth, something seemed off about the guy working there. His overly cheerful voice was almost robotic, and his appearance was unsettling. His mouth was too wide, his teeth too perfect, and his eyes resembled marbles. His neck seemed a bit too long, and his forearms were shorter than usual. Despite this, he processed our tickets and informed us of a new zoo wallet feature, insisting it was mandatory. Even though the situation felt odd, I went along with it to avoid causing any anxiety for Abby. The ticket booth guy mentioned the seal show at 12:15 before we entered the zoo. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling he left me with, but I tried to focus on enjoying the day with Abby. Inside, we were greeted by the typical sights: a gift shop, park maps, a snack shack, and some benches. I did my best to ignore the unease and concentrate on Abby's excitement. We headed to the first exhibit she wanted to see, but I could tell something was bothering her. When I asked, she admitted that the ticket booth guy had creeped her out too. We agreed not to let it ruin our day, and decided to stay vigilant but enjoy ourselves. First on our list were the penguins, but to our disappointment, their exhibit was empty. Abby quickly moved on to the elephants, only to find their area empty as well. While I thought it might be normal for some animals to be out of sight, Abby felt differently. As we continued exploring, we approached an ice cream stand, and Abby pulled me away, clearly disturbed. She pointed out that the ice cream vendor looked eerily similar to the ticket booth guy. I tried to calm her, suggesting they might be related and that we should keep walking. Finally, we reached the monkey and ape exhibits. Some were empty, but we saw chimps, orangutans, and baboons. As we watched them, Abby noticed they weren't acting right, and I struggled to reassure her. Abby decided to find a bathroom, leaving me alone to observe the animals more closely. I couldn't help but feel uneasy about the whole situation, but I tried to stay focused on making the best of our day at the zoo. I approached the glass of the orangutan enclosure, feeling a familiar unease. Monkeys and apes always felt too human to me, making it uncomfortable to see them in captivity. This time it was worse. One orangutan met my gaze, and the human-like expression in its eyes made my stomach turn. It weakly grabbed its side, wincing in pain, revealing a line of sore-looking stitches. I felt terrible, hating that I was supporting this place. Abby returned a few minutes later, and we left before she could see the orangutan's distress. Our next stop was the tiger enclosure. As we arrived, we saw a few tigers lying in the sun. This time, it was clear something was seriously wrong. Moms were pulling their kids away, and people were looking on in shock, some even laughing nervously, thinking it was a joke. We should have left right then. The signs were there, but we didn't listen. We approached the tigers and struggled to process what we were seeing. At first, they looked like tigers, but upon closer inspection, we realized they were people. They were painted with tiger stripes, had ears on top of their heads, longer torsos, and shorter limbs. They were human, horribly modified to look like tigers. Panic set in, and people started screaming and running for the exit. Abby and I did the same. We tried to call 911, but our phones were completely dead, not even turning on. Looking around, I saw others experiencing the same issue. Our phones had been fried by the link we were forced to click for our credit cards. Reaching the gate, an employee shut all the exits. Abby clung to my arm with all her strength. This employee looked just like the others we had seen, different hair color and height, but just as creepy and uncanny. He greeted us with a forced cheerfulness and insisted we stay for the seal show at 12:15. The crowd of around 50 people began to revolt, demanding to be let out. The employee's smile slowly turned into a frown as he grabbed a man from the crowd and, with the help of another employee, began to stretch his torso and shorten his limbs, transforming him into a human-tiger hybrid. The crowd fell silent in horror. The employee, now smiling again, directed us to the seal show. We followed in horror, feeling helpless. I was supposed to keep Abby safe, but I could hear her shaking breaths and feel her clammy hands holding mine. As we walked, we passed more enclosures with people transformed into animals. The bear exhibit had people covered in awkward patches of fur, their bodies morphed into unnatural shapes. The deer exhibit had people trying to stand on newly formed four legs, falling and screaming in pain, blood visible on their heads from antler implants. Finally, we arrived at the seal show. About 10 employees surrounded us, all with the same unsettling features. The setup was simple bleachers facing an in-ground pool and a platform with a microphone. The silence was deafening, filled with the anticipation of something terrible. An employee walked up to the platform, his footsteps echoing. He greeted us with forced enthusiasm, demanding a response. We nervously clapped, trying to avoid further transformations. The show began with music playing, and another employee dragged a bound and taped person to the pool. The person, painted gray with a fin taped to their feet, was thrown into the water, sinking helplessly. Panic ensued as people tried to escape, but the employees caught them, transforming them into grotesque animal-human hybrids. Abby and I sat in fear, unable to do anything. At least 20 people were thrown into the pool, helpless. After 30 minutes, the show ended. Only about 15 people remained on the bleachers. The employees took a bow and announced the zoo was closed, instructing us to exit the park. Abby seemed relieved but tried to contain her excitement. She started to cry, desperate to leave. I knew I had to do something, even if it made Abby angry and risked my life. The employees seemed less attentive, and I needed to act quickly. As we followed the group towards the exit, I slipped into some bushes, hoping not to be seen. I watched as the employees led Abby and the others out, trying hard to stay still and breathe. Once they were out of sight, I felt confident enough to search for anyone I could save. I started sprinting from exhibit to exhibit, looking for people who hadn't been transformed beyond recognition. The weight of deciding who could be saved was enormous. The employees' morphing abilities seemed limited to slightly altering limbs and torsos, but they couldn't grow ears, tails, fins, or fur. Running through the zoo, I realized that exhibits with dramatically larger or smaller animals than humans were empty. Only those with similar-sized animals had been replaced by people. The employees had a basic understanding of animal sizes, but were not always accurate. They knew penguins were too small and elephants too big, but their knowledge had limits. I called out to the transformed people, trying to see who could still respond. Most were silent or too far gone to help, but at the zebra exhibit, someone quietly called for help. I managed to enter the enclosure quickly. I approached the glass of the orangutan enclosure, feeling a deep sense of unease. Monkeys and apes always seemed too human, making it uncomfortable to see them in captivity. This time, the feeling was magnified. One orangutan met my gaze, its eyes so human-like that it made my stomach churn. It weakly grabbed its side, wincing in pain, revealing a line of sore-looking stitches. The sight was horrifying, and I felt a surge of guilt for supporting this place. Abby returned a few minutes later, and we left before she could see the orangutan's distress. Our next destination was the tiger enclosure. Arriving there, we saw a few tigers lying in the sun. It was immediately clear that something was seriously wrong. Mothers were pulling their children away, and people looked on in shock. Some even laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. We should have left right then, but we didn't heed as we got closer. It took us too long to comprehend what we were seeing. At first they appeared to be tigers, but then we realized they were people. They were painted with tiger stripes, had ears on top of their heads, and their torsos were elongated while their limbs were shortened. They were clearly human, horribly modified to look like tigers. Panic erupted, and people started screaming and running towards the exit. Abby and I joined the frantic crowd. We tried to call 911, but our phones were completely dead, not even turning on. Looking around, I saw others in the same predicament. It became clear that the link we were forced to click for our credit cards had fried our devices. At the gate, an employee shut all the exits. Abby clung to my arm with all her strength. This employee, like the others, had an uncanny, unsettling appearance. He greeted us with a forced cheerfulness and insisted we stay for the seal show at 12:15. The crowd, around 50 people, began to revolt, demanding to be let out. The employee's smile turned into a frown as he grabbed a man from the crowd and, with the help of another employee, began to stretch his torso and shorten his limbs, transforming him into a human-tiger hybrid. The crowd fell silent in horror. The employee, now smiling again, directed us to the seal show. We followed, horrified and feeling utterly helpless. My priority was to keep Abby safe, but I could hear her shaking breaths and feel her clammy hands holding mine. As we walked, we passed more enclosures with people transformed into animals. The bear exhibit had people covered in awkward patches of fur, their bodies grotesquely altered. The deer exhibit had people trying to stand on newly formed four legs, falling and screaming in pain, blood visible on their heads from antler implants. Finally, we arrived at the seal show. About 10 employees surrounded us, all with the same unsettling features. The setup was simple bleachers facing an in-ground pool and a platform with a microphone. The silence was deafening, filled with the anticipation of something terrible. An employee walked up to the platform, his footsteps echoing. He greeted us with forced enthusiasm, demanding a response. We nervously clapped, trying to avoid further transformations. The show began with music playing, and another employee dragged a bound and taped person to the pool. The person, painted gray with a fin taped to their feet, was thrown into the water, sinking helplessly. Panic ensued as people tried to escape, but the employees caught them, transforming them into grotesque animal-human hybrids. Abby and I sat in fear, unable to do anything. At least 20 people were thrown into the pool, helpless. After 30 minutes, the show ended. Only about 15 people remained on the bleachers. The employees took a bow and announced the zoo was closed, instructing us to exit the park. Abby seemed relieved but tried to contain her excitement. She started to cry, desperate to leave. I knew I had to do something, even if it made Abby angry and risked my life. The employees seemed less attentive, and I needed to act quickly. As we followed the group towards the exit, I slipped into some bushes, hoping not to be seen. I watched as the employees led Abby and the others out, trying hard to stay still and breathe. Once they were out of sight, I felt confident enough to search for anyone I could save. I started sprinting from exhibit to exhibit, looking for people who hadn't been transformed beyond recognition. The weight of deciding who could be saved was enormous. The employees' morphing abilities seemed limited to slightly altering limbs and torsos, but they couldn't grow ears, tails, fins, or fur. Running through the zoo, I realized that exhibits with dramatically larger or smaller animals than humans were empty. Only those with similar-sized animals had been replaced by people. The employees had a basic understanding of animal sizes but were not always accurate. They knew penguins were too small and elephants too big, but their knowledge had limits. I called out to the transformed people, trying to see who could still respond. Most were silent or too far gone to help, but at the zebra exhibit, someone quietly called for help. I managed to enter the enclosure quickly. Dropping to my knees, I couldn't believe how much worse it was up close. Their body was deformed into something unearthly, with fake zebra ears harshly sewn onto their head, hands sewn together to simulate hooves, and their body painted with cheap white paint and black stripes. A mane made of a cheap party wig was superglued to their head and down their neck. The worst part was the human face, unchanged and haunting. The sickly body made me nauseous, but the human face almost made me lose it. Some transformations were more elaborate than others, suggesting the employees ran out of time or rushed the last few. Realizing there was no way to help this person, I felt a wave of despair. Blind optimism had led me to believe I could make a difference, but now I knew I had to get out safely and alert the authorities. I felt regret for not ensuring Abby's safety first. If I had followed the group out, I could have called the police by now. As I sat in self-pity, I noticed something under the person. I pulled out a dirt-covered lanyard with a photo ID and a name Ken. Whispering his name, he looked up and smiled, a sad but grateful expression. His smile quickly turned to pain as he clutched his side, and I knew something was very wrong. I sat with him until he took his final breath, trying to hold back the overwhelming guilt. Giving up on saving anyone myself, I decided to escape. I spotted a brick wall at the back of the zoo and climbed over it, sustaining a few cuts and bruises. Once out, I headed to a gas station and used a phone to call 911. Then I called my sister to pick me up. I knew Abby's phone probably wasn't working either, but I tried calling her a few times while I waited. My sister drove me to Abby's house. Her mom answered the door looking angry. She said Abby didn't want to talk to me. Though sad, I was relieved she was safe. I understood and left. I kept checking the news, expecting to see reports about the zoo, but there was nothing. The next day, I drove back to the zoo. Despite the previous day's horror, it was busy, with people laughing and enjoying themselves. I needed a closer look, so I parked and walked up to the ticket booth. My hands were sweating as I approached, but I had to know what was going on. From the back of the line, I saw normal-looking employees. I bought a ticket and was welcomed by a friendly, albeit slow, employee. She mentioned that many previous employees had quit suddenly and the zoo was operating with new staff. Inside, everything seemed normal. The animals were back, looking healthy, and all the enclosures were as they should be. The horrific events from the previous day were completely covered up. I later found a couple of old employees who had the day off during the incident. One janitor described how he arrived the next morning to locked gates and hungry but otherwise fine animals. It seemed the creatures had taken the real animals elsewhere for safekeeping during their twisted display. Despite my efforts to piece everything together, I still don't fully understand what those morphing creatures were, or why they did what they did. They seemed to care about the animals, never using real animal parts for their creations, only cheap replicas. The new employees were clueless about the previous day's horrors. The incident was covered up, and the zoo claimed the employees had quit. Abby never wanted to speak about it again, and our relationship ended. She couldn't forgive me for leaving her, even if it was to try and help others. To this day, I remain haunted by the experience, unable to fully comprehend the creature's motives. This retelling is my attempt at closure, hoping to finally move on from the nightmare I lived through. Bonus story for you, my dear viewers. Working the graveyard shift as a cop is tough for many reasons, but the spookiness of the night tops the list. Now that might sound childish coming from a guy my size, but it's the truth. There's an almost alien feeling to being stuck in my car with no one else around. Maybe it would be different if I lived somewhere less forested than Wyoming, but here the trees are so thick that any nearby light is barely visible. Most nights are uneventful, just me and the silence. I usually catch up on a show or finish a book. Occasionally I get a call, but it's always something minor like a wellness check or a suspicious person near a bar. I actually enjoy these calls because they bring me back to more populated areas instead of some lonely gravel road looking for speeders. The job isn't exciting, but it pays the bills. 2 days ago, on a relatively warm night, something out of the ordinary happened. It was my first night shift after returning from vacation. Jimmy, the officer who covered for me while I was away, mentioned he finally understood what I meant about the creepiness. I laughed and told him I'd handle it for a while, suggesting he bring something to distract himself next time. Since I know what the transition from day to night shift is like, I wanted to make him comfortable. If he started taking more night shifts, I wouldn't have to sit in the dark as much. He handed me the keys, and I had an idea. Since this was my only night shift for the week, why not make it more enjoyable? I invited Jimmy to join me. He could either sit at a desk in the dimly lit precinct with just one other person, or hang out with me in the cruiser. Honestly, the blinding white walls of the station aren't much more comforting than the darkness, and he agreed pretty quickly. We parked in one of our usual hiding spots, settled in, watched a cheesy horror movie, and cracked open a few beers. Yeah, we probably shouldn't have been doing that, but who was going to arrest us? Plus, we weren't lightweight drinkers, so a couple of beers wouldn't get us tipsy. We didn't expect to be moving much anyway until my work phone rang. It was already 3 a.m., so at least we'd made it halfway through the shift before something happened. I heard giggling on the other end. I said hello a few times and was about to hang up when a familiar voice spoke. It was Brian, the only other officer on duty that night, manning the station's phone. Usually he sounded as monotone as a bored robot, so hearing him laugh was odd. Brian filled me in on the situation. He'd gotten an emergency call from the old AMEC factory on McHaben Road. The place didn't have power or phones, so how the caller reached him was a mystery. Apparently, the caller broke in to steal equipment and got stuck inside. It was quiet in the cruiser for a moment. Jimmy and I looked at each other and burst out laughing almost simultaneously. The absurdity of the situation was too much. I assured Brian we'd handle it. It was better than giving out another speeding ticket, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep a straight face. Brian told me to call if we needed backup, and he'd get someone from the precinct in Pinedale if necessary. With that, we set off to the factory, curious to see how this strange night would unfold. Piercing through the dark night as we sped down the road, careful not to hit any deer. The drive to the old AMEC factory only took about 10 minutes, but you never know what could jump out. When we reached the bramble-covered entrance, I got out to undo the rusted chain blocking the road. The factory had been abandoned for a decade after AMEC moved its operations north, taking half the town's population with it. Now it was a favorite spot for local teens to hang out, as evidenced by the graffiti covering the walls. We stepped out of the cruiser, turned on our flashlights, and began searching for an entrance. Jimmy was noticeably on edge, probably because he didn't know this place existed. Being relatively new to the area, I doubted he'd ever had to get out of the car on a night shift before. He went around the left side of the building while I took the right, both of us looking for a rusted door or a broken window. I was pulling brambles off my shorts when I suddenly heard Jimmy start yelling. I sprinted around the building, hand on my holster, ready for the worst. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a trap? Was the guy we were looking for a psycho out to get us? Rounding the corner, my flashlight illuminated Jimmy, doubled over and laughing. Confused, I asked if he was all right. He looked up at me with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. Turns out he was just messing with me. Relief washed over me, but I was mostly annoyed. It was nearly 4 a.m., and we were chasing some idiot in an abandoned warehouse. For a moment, I'd thought Jimmy was being attacked and would be lying in a bloody heap by the time I reached him. Seeing that I was pissed, his grin faded, and he started apologizing, saying he was just trying to lighten the mood. I took a deep breath, smiled, and assured him I'd get him back someday. For now, we needed to focus on getting inside. We found a broken window, likely where the guy had entered, and shone our flashlights inside to avoid stepping on nails or glass. As we climbed in, I radioed Brian to request backup just in case. Jimmy's prank had put me on edge, and I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The power was out, so we relied on our flashlights. We called out a few times, hoping for a response, but got nothing. We walked past old drills and ore processors, our footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. After searching the main room, we headed to the hallway at the back of the factory. I knew the layout pretty well from previous calls to clear out drunk partiers during the day, but it was a different beast at night. The hallway branched into 3 more, complicating things. This is where we made our first mistake. We decided to split up. I know, it's a horror movie cliche GC, but we were tired, and our energy drinks were wearing off. We kept our radios on and agreed to update each other if we found anything. I assumed the guy had already fled into the woods, but we had to check the place just in case. I didn't plan on arresting him. He'd had a rough night, and the old equipment he was after wasn't worth anything. Still, I wasn't thrilled about searching the entire back half of the factory, especially with 3 floors of rooms. The building was split into 2 sides with no internal connection, meaning if one of us found something, the other would have to walk all the way around. No wonder this place was abandoned. As I passed each room, I shone my flashlight in and called out. Jimmy seemed to be doing the same, based on his radio chatter. By the time I reached the 2nd floor, he was already on the 3rd. I told him to slow down to make sure each room was clear. Silence. I repeated myself, but still nothing. Suddenly, Jimmy's voice crackled through the radio. He said he saw something down the hall. A hand sticking out of a doorway, waggling its finger at him. I stopped in my tracks, telling him not to go near it and to back up slowly. I headed for the stairs, my rational side thinking someone was stuck and signaling for help. But another part of me was on high alert. As I reached the 1st floor, my gut told me to hurry, and I listened. Approaching the other building's entrance, my radio erupted with Jimmy's panicked voice. He shouted that there was a face, someone looking at him. My heart pounded as I rushed to his side, ready for anything. I didn't respond. I just sprinted toward the door at the end of the hall. Grabbing the handle, I pushed, but it wouldn't budge. I rammed my shoulder into it. shouting Jimmy's name. I heard faint yelling behind the door. Finally, the door gave way, and I sprinted up the dark staircase, pulling my radio from my belt. Whatever was happening up there, it wasn't good. Reaching the 3rd floor, I found the door locked again. I bashed my shoulder into it, calling Jimmy's name, but there was no response this time, just silence. I tried to open the lock, but the door still didn't move. Something had to be blocking it from the other side. I slammed against the door so hard that my gear started flying off my belt. My flashlight and other items all hit the ground. The flashlight rolled until it fell down the stairwell. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't have time to retrieve it. The door was starting to give, and I needed to get through. I kicked it so hard I thought I hurt my ankle, but finally it caved in enough for me to slip through into the hallway. Calling out Jimmy's name, I noticed a dim light at the end of the hall. Not a flashlight, but a faintly lit room. A silhouette stood in the doorway. It had to be him. I called out again, but didn't step closer. Then I heard giggling. It was faint, but it sounded like Jimmy. The giggling turned to laughter, and he started moving, jerking from side to side like he was dancing. Lowering my radio, I realized he was messing with me. Furious, I started yelling down the hall, frustrated that he scared me like that. I told him I thought someone was attacking him, and that he needed to stop fooling around. He almost gave me a heart attack. It had enough for one night. I stormed out, picking up my gear as I went. Climbing back out through the window, I stood in the darkness outside the factory, waiting for backup. Luckily, they arrived about 5 minutes later. I climbed into the back seat of their cruiser and buckled up, ready to head back to the station. The officer behind the wheel turned to look at me, then pointed to the factory. I saw a faint light shining from one of the windows, a flashlight beam illuminating a silhouette. It looked like Jimmy, but I didn't want to deal with him at that moment. I told the officer Jimmy could handle taking the car back to the station himself. With a nod, the officer shifted into reverse, and we backed out onto the main road. Once at the precinct, I thanked them for the ride, hopped into my truck, and drove home. Exhausted, I didn't care to wait for Jimmy. Jimmy didn't show up for work the next day, nor did he return the car. We thought he might have taken a sick day and forgot to call in, or was avoiding me after his prank. Everyone I told about it agreed that he probably felt bad and was worried about getting in trouble. That was my theory yesterday. He didn't show up today either, and everyone started to get worried, including me. We sent a couple of officers to the factory to check if he left the cruiser there or took a ride home and left it there. Sure enough, it was parked in the same spot. They called me to help search the area. It was my day off, so I was annoyed, but I wanted to make sure he was okay. We searched the entire factory and found nothing until we reached the 3rd floor hallway. I got there last and found one officer looking uneasy in the corner, and another shielding his eyes. I pushed past them into the hallway. The floor had a dark trail leading to the end of the hall. Hanging from the doorway was Jimmy. He looked like he had been in a tough situation. His uniform was torn, and he looked hurt. Most disturbing was that his arms and legs were bound in a strange way. I didn't join the others in feeling sick. I stood there, stunned. That changed when I walked into the room behind him. Above him, attached to the doorway, was a strange pulley system. His arms and legs had been threaded through it. He looked like a puppet.